First of all, I would like to thank everyone here for participating. It means a lot to us. We are the Science Policy Group. We connect policymakers, scientists, and the general public. We try to bring the cutting edge research that each of us and other scientists around the world do to the general public and have it used to implement pro-science policy. And we do that by supporting that pro-science legislation, and for informing constituents, training our graduate and undergraduate students to work with policy and the science that they do. And we go and advocate for a lot of causes. For example, last week we went to Springfield to advocate for the Clean Energy Jobs Act. We talked to a bunch of senators and House representatives to try and gain support for that. And we're going to try and support that this coming session in January also. So first of all, I would like each of you to introduce yourselves, what you do, what your expertise is, and one thing that you really enjoy about your work.
Oh, sure. So hi, my name is Leland, Cogliani. My area of expertise is in energy, energy policy, energy R&D, as well as nuclear security. So a lot of the science and technology that supports the nuclear weapons stockpile and our non-proliferation missions. In terms of my background, I am not a scientist, so I've come to it more from the policy side. I had a degree in international affairs. I thought I was going to go into the Foreign Service. That was going to be my career track. My now wife did not want to live overseas. So I had to change career track last minute because I did take the Foreign Service exam. I passed and was going to be placed. And so I ended up applying to the Government Accountability Office, which is a federal agency, but on the congressional side as opposed to the executive branch. And it's the lead auditing arm of Congress, and ended up in the International Affairs and Trade Division of GAO, and did a lot of foreign development type work, including peacekeeping, but then ended up going to a different division looking at energy, environment, and nuclear security. And then I started my career track in terms of energy and national security because of that. And I visited all of the Department of Energy national labs, spoke to scientists, engineers, research universities, lab directors, private industry in the sector, and I kind of learned through osmosis. And then the second part of my career track then was a position in the Senate on the Appropriations Committee, which controls funding and money. And again, I was on the energy subcommittee. So my primary areas of responsibility were in energy, R&D, fundamental research in the physical sciences, including all of that nuclear security portfolio. And now I've been at Lewis Burke for 4 years.
Hi, I'm Erin. My background is that I have a PhD in neurobiology and anatomy, but I wound up in this space because when I was an undergraduate, I worked for James Thompson at the University of Wisconsin doing research on stem cells. During that time was when President Bush was deciding what restrictions to put on those cell lines. So I had always been interested in politics, but hadn't known there was a space for people to leverage their scientific expertise and apply it to policy making. I had planned to get my PhD, so I went and did that. And following my PhD training, I volunteered a little bit within Utah to try to get some experience to see if I even liked policy making, working for a state nonprofit that was focused on healthcare policy, and was able to leverage some past experiences and connections to get a fellowship at Research America, which is a biomedical research advocacy group. And from there, I took a position at the Association for Women in Science, focusing on public policy, so leveraging science policy as well as broader, more gender-based issues and advocacy related to that. And then I followed that up by coming to Lewis Burke, where I've been for about 5.5 years now. And for the firm here, I cover issues related to biomedical and social science, as well as some ag issues.
So, hello, my name is Libby O'Hare. Can you still hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we're getting a little message here. My name is Libby O'Hare, and here at Lewisburg, my area of expertise is in biomedical and life sciences, as well as the regulatory environment that governs the research and administrative process. So we think of research administration and grants policy and some of the complexities associated with that. Like my colleague Erin, I'm trained in neuroscience, so I received my PhD from UCLA in 2008. I completed a postdoctoral fellowship at UC Berkeley and was there for 2 years. I then transitioned into science policy through the AAAS Science Policy Fellowship. That's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For me, when I was in graduate school, I began to kind of engage in this period of introspection and reflection around, what would my career path look like? And I realized for a number of different reasons that a tenure track sort of academic research position was not in the cards for me. This was largely due to the fact that I felt that I had a set of interests and skills that I really did not get to use in that kind of academic research setting. I thought that I might be able to, to leverage some of these skills around communication and interpersonal skills to benefit science broadly. And so that prompted me to start to look for different opportunities. I learned about the AAAS Fellowship. I applied and was successful. I was actually a congressional fellow, so I worked as a fellow for a year in the House of Representatives with Representative Rush Holt. He's now retired from Congress. And that transition, going from being a postdoc in a neuroscience lab to working on Capitol Hill, was quite dramatic on many different levels. But I found that I really, really loved working on Capitol Hill. I loved the pace. I loved the opportunity to work on many, many different topics. And I felt like I was constantly learning about new things. Oddly enough, while I was working with Rush, I worked on his energy and environment portfolio. That was just a position that opened up. I wanted to stay on the Hill. And so I was hired on as a legislative assistant, and I managed that issue portfolio for him. I then felt that while I was interested in those issues, that what I really wanted to work on were issues related to higher education and science and innovation. So I left Capitol Hill. I went to the National Academy of Sciences, where I spent about 3 years directing several different high-profile studies looking at the science and engineering workforce and sort of STEM workforce development from a regional perspective, as well as regulatory issues and research. I've been at Lewisburg for about 4 years now, and I work closely with Erin on the biomedical research area, and I lead our firm's efforts on sort of NIH, biomedical, and again, those research administration issues.
Okay, thank you all for sharing your experiences. So I'm gonna start with the 2 open floor questions now. So since we're a group of students with our faculty sponsor that advocate for science and policy to combine and basically make pro-science policy at the forefront of everybody's minds. So when advocating for policy outcomes, what kinds of research do you guys put into fact sheets or other informational media before you present them to stakeholders?
You want us each answer? Do you want us to each answer this, or
Which you can answer, or you can just, one of you can generally well, maybe if you each have a different way of doing it, you could each talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I'll start in terms of kind of the energy area. So what's important there, just general principle when you're talking about policy, which is very different than the academic world and the scientific method, is you need to start with the bottom line up front, right? So you know, based on all the scientific research that you might have done for years, you know, what is the recommendation that you're giving a policymaker in terms of why you're investing in specific technology areas? Why, for example, a carbon tax is the most effective way of instituting change and attacking climate change. What are examples of impact, for example, on scientific research that's been done at a university or more broadly from a collection of universities? And so I think it's the message on top, all the details that went into that scientific research are irrelevant because you only often have a very small amount of time to talk with legislators and policymakers. And in terms of the types of resources that you use, you know, we use a combination of things in terms of it could be that one-page fact sheet that explains kind of these high-level concepts. It could be in the form more and more of kind of that 2-minute YouTube video where you're starting to blend media, you know, and then enhancing that content through tweeting and photos from an event or something, and so more and more using all of those tools and from social media to more traditional to help enhance that message. But again, what's more important than any specific tool is the clarity of that message and how the science then supports that good policy without having to explain all your formulas and all the scientific research that went into it.
And I would build on Leland's answer, which I agree with, and I would build on it just by maybe being a little bit provocative, and actually saying that in many cases the science isn't what matters. It's can you craft a compelling narrative or a compelling story that appeals to universal values, and you use the science to support that story. So when you're advocating for a particular position, the science supports a compelling narrative or story that you might be telling. And I would also just add that we spend a lot of time thinking about the many different ways in which we communicate in an advocacy situation. Advocacy looks different depending on the person to whom you are speaking. If they are an expert on the issue from the congressional perspective, that's one thing, versus someone who only has a passing level of familiarity with the topic. How you communicate is going to be very different, and how you bring to bear the power of data and evidence is also going to be different in those different settings.
Yeah, as you're talking, thinking about a lot of the advocacy we've done on more of the regulatory side, and especially about higher ed policies, you know, making the case there looks really different from when you come in and you're trying to educate people on a basic scientific concept. I think regardless, you know, trying to use data to drive your point, whatever it is, in a way that's concise, using graphics is always more effective, I think, than a ton of text, and trying to keep it simple and informative while also being accurate and not straying too far into the emotional side of arguments at all. It's one of the most effective ways. But I was curious what they would have to say, since they've had to meet with constituents and been on the receiving side as well.
Thank you for that. Well, now that you've talked about meeting with various different people and organizations, do you, I don't know if all of you do, but do you guys work with large companies? And if so, how do you navigate the intricacies between business politics and also supporting science-based policies that aren't necessarily always in line with these the plans of these big corporations?
Sure. So I think to be clear, so we at Lewis Burke, we do not have private sector industry clients. We work with research universities, scientific societies, and certain management organizations. But with that said, in to advance many areas of science, all areas of science. Public-private partnerships are essential. So all of us have connections, through years of work experience with various private sector companies. And what we try to do when it makes sense and it advances the goals of our academic institutions or scientific societies, sometimes pair them with certain private sector partners. So on the energy side, as a perfect example, whether it's competing to manage one of the large-scale national labs, whether it's putting together a coalition around an energy center, or doing demonstration projects, for example, in Illinois, a lot on carbon capture, sequestration, utilization around coal-fired facilities and natural gas-fired facilities. That's where you could do the blame game and say, well, you coal industry are to blame, for high CO2 levels, and you should be out of business. Or even if the US, for example, were to abandon coal, India and China, for example, are building massive new plants. And so how do we work even on an international market, for example, in advancing carbon capture sequestration technologies that we'll need for the next 30 to 40 years? And so that's an example of, us working with the private sector in this, when it makes sense to pair our clients more on the research university side to advance, in this case, say broader energy goals, but it's true of even, say, in the biomedical space. You can have the greatest idea on a university campus, but if you don't actually have a pharmaceutical company or a diagnostic company or something that develops either the drug or the therapeutic or the device, then it's only a good idea and doesn't get anywhere. So.
One of the challenges, especially for some of our societies, is that they often have a broad representation from industry, which can sometimes be at odds with the academic perspective on things. So finding consensus is usually the objective, whereas something where both sides of the discussion feel like they can each be comfortable with making a case, using evidence to support it, and agreeing that it's in the best interest of the discipline. But it creates huge challenges at times.
Yeah. And related to this too is an issue where I think we all three of us have done some work, which is that there's oftentimes a lot to be said for working in coalitions. Coalitions allow people or organizations with kind of disparate, perhaps political perspectives to work together for a common goal. And often that common goal, as Erin mentioned, is sort of perhaps like the
lowest common denominator.
The lowest common denominator, or sort of the single top level thing that everyone can agree on. So for example, both pharmaceutical companies, patient advocacy organizations, and universities can all agree that the NIH should be funded at, X billion dollars this year and should have robust funding. When you get any more down into the weeds, you might have to see different political opinions there. So these broad coalitions can be helpful both for finding consensus among advocacy organizations, but also communicating to congressional policymakers that these are important issues that touch different sectors.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the reasons why this was an important question for us was because when we did go to Springfield to advocate for CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, we actually found that a lot of the pushback did come from big companies that we weren't necessarily getting involved with, but that were still involved with persuading policymakers one way or the other. So that's why we wanted to know how that worked. I will now do a round where I ask each of you individual questions. I will start with Leland, if that's okay.
Sure.
So as the co-chair of the Energy Science Coalition, we assume that, and we've also just talked about the Clean Energy Jobs Act, or CEJA. Do you think that this aggressive green policy can help Illinois in terms of sustainability, but also whether it can convince the rest of the US to have similar policies in place?
Sure. So yes, I am familiar with that legislation, and I think what's important, especially in the current political environment at the federal level, where Congress and the administration can't agree at the moment on energy policy, is for states to lead the way. And so a bill like the Clean Energy Jobs Act is essential and important to advance those goals and to, I think, chart the path forward for then higher level federal policy making. Whether you look at the way that, for example, the Affordable Care Act came together on the healthcare side, or the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was the last time that Congress weighed in and we had a federal energy policy act. All of the best ideas really came from the states and adopting those best practices, but still leaving enough flexibility for each state, where especially in energy is so dependent on the type of energy mix and the workforce that you have. So it's no one size fits all. It's more local, statewide, and regional in terms of the energy assets that you can bring in place. I think just as a high level point, what's important when you're mandating specific energy goals, I would say, based on many discussions on this topic, that there really is an all of the above energy strategy, and one that focuses on clean energy targets and not use renewable energy, because renewable energy implies you're only for energy efficiency. But I would argue, and many have argued, there's a big role for nuclear energy to continue to play, as well as natural gas will be a bridge fuel for many, many decades, and it's very cheap and low cost and US produced. And so how do we attach carbon capture, sequestration, utilization, and those types of technologies also to natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel, and you can't abandon that overnight. So I think having those clean energy targets that are technology neutral is kind of the next best thing, other than having a carbon tax, in terms of having a market-based approach of which technologies can meet both reliability, resiliency goals, cost goals, and the CO2 and greenhouse gas emission type goals as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question will be so one of the other associations that you're a member of is the Arms Control Association. As part of the policymaking process, we know that states analyze the policies implementing in other states, like we talked in the last question, and based on whether they have worked out, factor this into their decision-making process. What do you think the federal government does not, why do you think the federal government does not do the same thing with federal policies, especially in cases of gun control, by looking at other countries, like states look at each other when making statewide decisions?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a purely political issue in the sense that in terms of, gun control specifically, since 1996, what's been in place is called the Dickey Amendment, which was named after a Republican congressman from Arkansas that introduced it into the spending bills in that given year, which has been in effect since then. And that what essentially did is it froze all federal investments and into studying gun violence in the United States, including what other countries are doing and what both states and other countries are doing. And that primarily is for the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, that would have that responsibility. What's interesting, though, is that maybe for the first time in many decades, that may be changing, in the sense that last year in the spending bill, they loosened that restriction. So for the first time since 1996, and it was a bill that President Trump signed into law, which clarifies that CDC, in fact, can use federal funding to study gun violence issues. And now it's a question of actually putting money towards that. But the fact that, that clarification has happened for the first time in many years is, I'm hoping, a hopeful sign that even if it doesn't drive immediate changes in terms of gun control, at least we can have a more common a set of facts of what causes gun violence and what are policies that could help prevent it or mitigate it in the future. At least that's a good starting point from a policy perspective. But in terms of why there hasn't been more, a combination of just the politics around gun issues and this longstanding amendment that has prevented federal agencies from spending the money has been the biggest roadblock. But this is the first I've seen in terms of easing it in 20 years. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction.
Okay. And now going back to the discussion, I know you already talked about clean energy versus renewable energy. But we also had a question about if you were asked to make a policy recommendation that would actually help shift the country towards a higher level of sustainability in terms of their energy uses, with the looming threat of climate change obviously in mind, what would you recommend either the federal government impose or each state government impose? And I know you also talked about the use of natural gas and nuclear power.
Sure. I mean, at a high level, I mean, this could be a discussion of an entire TED Talk. My quick, easy answers are, I would definitely double investments in research and development in clean energy technologies. You have to think better ways, also improvements in energy efficiency, and that we're falling far short on our target goals. And that comes with a lot of kind of social and behavioral science elements to it, because there are, for example, just if everyone were to switch out light bulbs from old incandescents to the new OLED bulbs that you can get off the shelf for relatively low cost, that right there would reduce energy consumption by 2 or 3% across the entire United States. But how to get people to do that is still a challenge and has not been focused on enough. And then I already mentioned, focused, because I don't think politically a carbon tax is feasible anytime soon. I think focusing on those clean energy goals that are technology and energy source neutral are the best way to go. So to me, if you were to have a kind of a Green New Deal, those I think would be the key elements. And then the last part of that is when you're shifting, from legacy energy sources like coal, something that needs to be kept in mind from a policy perspective is the impact that has on communities. So this comes up a lot, especially with Senator Manchin, who's currently the ranking member on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He is all for renewable energy and transitioning away from coal, even though he lives in a heavy coal state of West Virginia. But what he doesn't appreciate, though, is that we have just abandoned those communities by transitioning to other energy sources. And so how do we, either through retraining or some distributive tax mechanism, make sure that those communities are not left behind because we're transitioning to different energy sources.
Okay, thank you for all your answers. I will move on to Elizabeth. We have a few questions for you also. So you mentioned in your opening statement, so to speak, that the transition was very different when you moved from, there was a large transitional gap between moving from academia to policy. And since the majority of the science policy group is actually composed of graduate students that have an interest in policy, what kind of skills do you think are important in developing a career in policy, going into a career in policy straight from either a PhD or a postdoc or even from undergrad?
Sure. I think it's a little bit different for undergrads versus someone coming from a PhD level or postdoc. But so I think that as a scientist, when you transition into a career in science policy, what you're really doing is you're using your transferable skills that you get with a scientific training. So, the ability to think strategically, the ability to define a problem, identify how to get from sort of point A to point B to point C to solve that problem, project management, the ability to communicate, I think is a critical one. We get that training as scientists. I think we often have to broaden out the ways in which we communicate. I was talking about that a little bit earlier. I also think that one sort of skill that's important, which I'm 9 years into this and I'm still working on, so I'm still developing this, is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. So policy and science policy is not science. It's much more of an art than a science. And so I think at the outset of my science policy fellowship, for example, I had no idea which way was up, which way was down, which way was left, which way was right. And it was really like being in a totally new environment. And I had to sort of trust that I would eventually pick up some of the key ideas, concepts, and skills for working in that particular kind of environment. And I have to be able to tolerate some of the ambiguity associated with the policy space. So that's a skill that I'm still developing. So it's not something that you can take a class in, the ability to tolerate ambiguity, but I think it is a crucial one.
So to add on to that, what would you have wanted to know before you stepped foot into this other world of policy as when you graduated with your PhD? What do you think is the most valuable piece of information that you've learned now that you wish you had learned before that would have made it easier?
So I think just to kind of stick on that theme, so that the ability to tolerate, that I would need to be able to sort of work in that setting. So I think scientists are very comfortable with the concept of uncertainty. In fact, that's just kind of the nature of science. But ambiguity is something, to me, slightly different than uncertainty. So I wish I had known that. I think I also wish that I had known how, or I should say, what scientists have to really grapple with when they come to Washington is that even when the science is perfectly clear, science is only one part of a decision-making process for policymakers. So we know the science of climate change is, unrefutable, right? But yet that science is still only one piece of the puzzle. It's only one part of the decision-making process. There are many competing interests in a policy-making setting, especially in Congress. And I think scientists struggle with this because science is not a democracy. It's actually designed so that the best ideas rise to the top, and they're what we sort of pin our faces upon. And that's just not how it works in the in the policy space. So I think I've learned that, and if someone had told me that at the outset, it would have been intriguing to me.
Okay, thank you. And to just shift gears a little bit, but sort of continue the conversation. There has been a report in the Journal of Environmental Science and Policy that they reported that first world countries like the US outsource most of their carbon emissions to developing countries in order to reduce their own domestic emissions. So are we decreasing our own health risks by doing this? And do emissions and disease caused by them respect national boundaries?
So, I think the answer is, of course not. I think that this is also true within the United States. The recognition I'm looking at Leland because I know he knows this too, in the 60s and the 70s, when the Environmental Protection Agency was being discussed and eventually created, was that pollution in Ohio affects citizens in New Jersey, for example, because of just the way that climate works. And so I think, of course not. I think that an issue like climate change is a global problem and is going to require global solutions. And of course, that's why the news yesterday, was it yesterday or the day before, this week, that the United States now is the only country to leave the Paris Climate Accord is really, really troubling. So, yeah.
Thank you for answering those questions. I now have some questions for Erin also. So we'll start with this one, actually. When advocating for bioscientific issues that receive a lot of hate in politics, I know you talked about your personal experience with stem cell policy. And so how do you address these misconceptions that a lot of the public have about these policies in order to push for expansion of either funding or to have better policy that will allow us to do more of that sort of research, whether it be stem cells or any other biofield?
So Libby made a perfect point about how policymaking isn't just about the science, it's about far more complex issues. That's one factor. And so there's a lot of different ways to try to tackle these issues, right? We can come at it straight with the data, but that can leave you tearing your hair out as a scientist because you can fail to get through to people who have strong emotional convictions. And we know confirmation bias is a real challenge when it comes to changing people's hearts and minds on things that are, more fraught, like vaccines, for example. People have a belief that they are, clinging too strongly, even if it's not evidence-based necessarily. So one of the challenges coming to DC for me was, how do I try to figure out how to find messaging that will resonate on these topics? And a lot of times I look to see what other people who seem like unnatural allies in this space are doing. When I was in Utah, Orrin Hatch one day had put on an event on campus to talk about stem cells because he was, though Mormon and extremely religious, he was a big proponent of stem cell research. And it was a fascinating opportunity to get some insight into how a Republican who would otherwise seem to be very opposed would think about it. And he really pushed, the importance of saving children's lives, using the potential to try to tug at the heartstrings of the people that showed up for this event, who were ones that either came because they were interested in learning more perhaps about the topic, which they weren't going to get there because Orrin was all about the thrilling circus aspects of it. But looking to see then from the messaging he used, what other kinds of lines was he using in the media, and what seemed to resonate with the people that supported him. So I don't think it's easy to do. The other issue is thinking about how you can make a case that resonates with that constituency. So when you're talking about climate change, you're talking about public health issues, you look for what is going to resonate most clearly with that district and that individual's priorities, try to frame it through that lens.
Okay.
Can I just add, just to jump in, not on stem cells specifically, but in advocacy, at the end of the day, you don't have to change everyone's mind, right? You will have people that no matter what you do and what you say, they will never change their mind. What's most important though is, who are the key decision makers? Who control the levers of power? And can you get enough of them to be your allies and your champions, or some of them that maybe don't be educated or don't have a specific position, or that because they're more evidence-based, you can actually make a compelling argument and they might change their mind. But you're going to have some, like climate change is a perfect example. There's a core group of 80 House Republicans that I know I will never change their mind, and they're a lost cause, but I can work around them. And so that also has to factor in. Does it matter that I can't convince this one person if that person is not as relevant to what I need to get done, right?
And the sad part is anecdotes work really well on the Hill. You know, people's hearts and minds change and sign up to support things.
Well, yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was referring to earlier in our conversation around being deliberately provocative and saying, actually, often the science isn't the most important. It's that compelling narrative that can really change people's perspective, where of course the data and the science are important as a supporting kind of, you know, footnote to that, but it's really that compelling story.
Right, thank you. We actually did have like a very similar experience when talking to supporters that were actually already supporting things like CEJA, and them telling us like, well, maybe going to this Republican isn't going to be worth your time. You should focus on people that are likely to support it anyway. And one of the lawmakers even told us that sometimes it's not even about good policy or bad policy, it's about good politics for them. So I appreciate what all of you brought to the table in saying that sometimes, for example, like Erin said, and both of you said about people that have completely different perspectives but approach it from like a more emotional level, or avoiding certain people altogether doesn't necessarily take away, well, actually, in this case, probably helps us. But going back to Erin and some questions, one of the well, the few areas of your expertise are also to do with social justice, diversity, and inclusion. And so what is important to us, and I believe that it's becoming more and more important with all policies, is how do you think we can make policies for and also advocate for vulnerable communities that are most affected by a lot of things like lack of affordable health care or lack of clean drinking water, and that are also affected by things like climate change? How do we bring them to the table and bring them into the decision-making process, since they're the people that are most affected? And how do we make these policies work for them?
So some of my answer to this is similar to my previous answer, but a lot of it is making the case for why any member should get involved in this particular issue. If you want to talk about access to clean water and you're talking to a Southern representative, don't go in talking about Flint, right? That's not going to resonate with them, but instead talk about what are the vulnerabilities in their district? What does their water infrastructure look like? How likely are individuals in that community to be exposed to lead? Think about things that will help resonate and get them interested and make it harder for them to walk away, make it harder for, them to say, actually, I don't care about this aspect of my constituency, even though we're talking about a big national issue. How do you frame it through the local interests and make it so that it's hard for them to, say no? But these are all really challenging issues, and social justice is sometimes one of the trickiest ones, simply because, again, it's a fraught emotional issue that's totally separate from, the economic case that can be made and separate from the science. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you guys want to weigh in too, because this is, it's always that balance, trying to figure out how to, make your case using the data and evidence, but using what's also going to actually resonate with those individual offices.
Yeah, well, I think with Congress in particular, it's about constituents. You need their constituents to actually go and talk to the office and the member and the representatives and the senators, because then it becomes personal, and it's about a potential voter, and it's about impacting the state or local or district's community itself. So now you've raised a vested interest for that member, for that senator, and it doesn't matter if it's a national issue or not, but now you're bringing attention to that local voter that local constituent.
And I would add here too, so the three of us we're obviously based in Washington, D.C. We're focused on the federal level. One of the features of this space, and I think it's a reasonably well-known fact, is while most people living in the United States can tell you the name of the president of the United States, and I mean at any time, I don't necessarily mean, President Trump, but in fact, the person whose name they don't know is their local select man or select woman, who actually has a much bigger impact on their day-to-day life. And I think, although I have not worked at this level, and I live in Washington, D.C., so I am also disenfranchised at the federal level. I've not, those local officials, I think, actually do a reasonably good job of getting out there into the communities and engaging directly with some of these vulnerable populations. So I think that's one of the nuances here. The other thing I'll say to kind of agree with both of my colleagues is that every single member of Congress has some group of people in their district or their state that could be considered a vulnerable population. So on some level, many of them, almost all of them, are reachable on these issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then last point to add on that is that, yes, if you can get your, say, local representatives, so your state delegates and senators, the mayors, the governor, they will amplify that message at the federal level, speaking to the U.S. senators, the U.S. representatives, various cabinet level agency officials, for example. We've done this, for example, on this is on a pure science project, but when we're doing this groundbreaking out at Fermilab, that is actually in your neck of the woods near Illinois, is having some of the local mayors, and we had the governor come, that amplified the message for the Department of Energy that's funding the project, as well as for our two senators, Durbin and Duckworth, were there. But by showing that the mayors of the local communities, as well as the governor, took the time to come to the event, speak to the senators personally and to the Department of Energy on the importance of this project in terms of creating jobs, in terms of the future, hopefully, Nobel Prizes and technology spin-offs and all the stuff associated with it. So if you can also get your local members to be champions, they can then amplify what happens at the federal level.
Okay, thank you for those answers again. This is again for Erin, but Elizabeth can definitely weigh in on this. So as women, what do you believe have been some of the challenges that you faced both in the scientific and in the policy fields?
So this is a fun question. Yeah, I think that there are challenges in science no matter who you are, whether you come from an underrepresented background or you're a woman, or even if you struggle with imposter syndrome but look to everybody else like the model of a scientist. Everybody struggles with things differently. I happen to have a fairly sunny disposition, and I was told by many people that I wasn't serious enough to be taken seriously as a scientist, which did not encourage me in science, but that's not why I left at all. So, I mean, even though I've definitely had people that haven't taken me seriously for whatever reason, I try not to internalize those kind of messages. And I think in other times, being a woman has been an advantage. When I worked for the Association for Women in Science, I would oftentimes go to events and I would be the only woman in the room. And given that my background was in biomedical science, I usually had classes that were pretty heavily co-ed. As I look back, I had some where there weren't a lot of women, but I was rarely the only woman. And that was a little nerve-wracking at times, but that also meant that people were very interested in what I had to say in a way that they wouldn't be just for anybody else that got up in line to speak different things. And so, everything's challenges and opportunities, and I try to focus on the positives and how to spin it to your advantage and leverage what you have. I'm also really tall, so I like to wear 3-inch heels, especially if I'm usually the only woman, because that means small men have to come up and talk to me, and then they have to look way up to even make eye contact with me. So you
it.
kind of have to like lean into the skit. So that's.
So I have an interesting take on this, which is other than some sort of annoyances. So I mean, every woman alive has been mansplained to use the parlance of our times. To me, that's more of an annoyance. Typically, something that I usually laugh at, later on in the day or behind closed doors. I haven't really faced too many challenges in terms of being a woman. I will say and take this opportunity to put a plug in here. So I attended a women's college, and I think for women who are interested in STEM, especially, that was a great environment. It gave me the opportunity to really see female champions in fields that historically have been where women have been underrepresented. So I don't think that's the only reason, but I just have had, I guess, some pretty good experiences, and haven't really, beyond the annoyances, really faced significant challenges. I will say that having in your title doctor does help in communicating to others that you are someone to be taken seriously.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a wrap on all of the questions. I really wanted to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to speak with me. And our club was very excited about this opportunity also. So thank you for that. And we will be posting this on our website and probably on YouTube, so you can check out how it all turned out. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Sure.
Great. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you.
Yep. Take care.